Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome back to Team APS. I'm Paul, and in today's video, we're going to be covering 20 different Yu-Gi-Oh! Side deck cards for the 2019 meta format and how you can use them. Obviously, this is very important because in the tournament scene right now, there are a lot of different decks and a lot of different matchups, and I would say that side decking is probably at its peak in terms of like needing to know how to do it, what you can use to counter all the different things you'll face. So yeah, that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to talk about them all. Okay, let's hop in. So first card is Nibiru, the Primal Being. It's kind of the talk of the town right now. Obviously this card is strong for a lot of different reasons. If your opponent has summoned 5 or more monsters in a turn, then you can activate Nibiru, tribute everything on the field, that's face up at least, and then you summon a token to your opponent's side of the field and you'll get Nibiru himself. This is dangerous and deadly for very obvious reasons. If your opponent's playing a combo deck that needs to make a lot of different monsters to actually complete its combo, then Nibiru is extremely deadly to them. It will cut their combo off, it will send all their monsters to the grave, they've run through a lot of resources and combo pieces, and they're left with basically nothing. It's useful against so many different matchups. Salamangreats in particular have a very tough time against it, but also Orcus, which are quite popular. The Thunder Dragon, Guard Dragon decks, those are also just very vulnerable to this card. And really just anything that spams out monsters, which is, even like stray decks you find in early rounds of a tournament might still fall under that criteria. So I think that the best way to use Nibiru is kind of twofold. So first of all, you of course want to make sure that you summon it in the main phase. So if your opponent's about to enter the battle phase, you can still use it at the end of the main phase. That's something to keep in mind. Another important thing though is you want to use it at a time when your opponent cannot easily recover from it. So if you use it after they've maybe invested a lot of important resources, then you might get the most use out of it. This means that you sometimes don't have to actually use it after your opponent has summoned 5 monsters. You could wait until they've summoned 7 or 8 or 9, but be sure that you use it before they get out a monster in the field that can negate its effect. That monster could be something like, Mythical Beast Jackal King, for instance, or Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon. Cards like that can negate monster effects can actually negate Nibiru because it is a monster effect. That said though, it is immune to things like Called by the Grave, so it's a very easy card to use. Just make sure that you're using it properly. A second similar card is the Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere mode. Now this one's been around for a lot longer and we all kind of know what it does. You tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters and you just summon it to their field. This is something that's really useful if you're going second because you can hard draw into it and it's still really great. That's an advantage that you don't necessarily get with Nibiru. Also, the Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere mode, it's a cost to tribute everything and just summon it. So that means that even if your opponent has monsters that can, negate things, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend or anything like that, you can just still tribute them away and they're gone and Sphere mode's there. The thing is though, this card is a little bit slower than Nibiru, and the big disadvantage there is that if your opponent can, say, make a field of monsters that either can't be tributed or they can find some way to reach in your hand and get it, because that is a popular thing now. Some people play cards like Exchange. That can be a really, scary card for this to deal with. And also, you don't get a normal summon when you make Raw Sphere mode, and that's something that you should keep in mind. So if the turn that you summon it, you can't actually make a play without normal summoning, then you need to be a little careful. Slower paced decks like, let's say, a Mech Knight Invoked deck might actually have a little bit of trouble. If you only open with a normal summon monster like Alistair the Invoker and you have to use Raw Sphere mode, you gotta be kind of wary because your opponent is still they're gonna have the token and they'll have lost their monsters, but you can't normal summon, so you can't get your play started, and the next turn they might still be able to beat you. Still though, this is a very good card for wiping away troublesome monsters, so I still recommend using it at all. So next is the usual array of hand traps. This is going to assume that you're already running Ash Blossom, so the main ones I'm talking about are Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion, Effect Veiler also, and sure, why not, we'll include Infinite Impermanence in the conversation as well because it might as well be. So Ghost Ogre is particularly useful against decks that have effects that activate for monsters that are already on the field. This can get rid of different link monsters so that your opponent actually loses access to the arrows, so that could be really useful for something like Heavy Metal Foes Electromite against a Pendulum deck. Or against a Pendulum deck, it can be a good way to deal with Serpent of Endymion. You can also use it against some Sky Striker cards like Multi-Roll, for instance. So if you get rid of Multi-Roll, that means they won't be able to recur all their spells back in the end phase, and it makes Sky Strikers infinitely easier to deal with. Ghost Spell can be useful for a lot of different matchups too. So against Thunder Dragon, it's a great way to deal with Thunder Dragonhawk because it summons one of your opponent's monsters in the grave. Even if they were going to summon one that's banished, you can still use Ghost Spell against this. It's also really good for dealing with Sky Striker Kagari because when she goes to re-add Sky Striker engage from their graveyard to their hand, you can use Ghost Spell and stop it. And one advantage that this has over a card like, say, DD Crow is, in this instance, when they make Sky Striker Shizuku in the end phase, which they usually will do, they wouldn't be able to use its effect to search on their copy of Engage, because Engage will be in their grave and Shizuku has to search something that has a different name. So this way you actually kind of killed two birds with one stone. And of course, Ghost Spell still works for all the usual things. It can stop anything that summons monsters from the graveyard. That's, any Monster Reborn type of card that's useful in a lot of different matchups. But yeah, this is one that's definitely worth keeping in mind. And then finally, you've got Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence, which are similar in they also have a few niche applications as well. So Effect Veiler obviously is very useful for dealing with something like Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite. It's a really strong choke point against something like, say, Nightmare Mermaid and almost any Orcust variant. And it's just a general good way to stop a deck that needs its normal summon. So that could be something stray like, a dinosaur deck that needs to summon something like, say, Overraptor and get its effect, or some deck that needs to summon Alistair the Invoker, Trickstar Candina. All of these things come to mind. And Impermanence can do all the same, but it is a little bit more flexible because even if you draw it in your turn when you're going second, it can still be useful for either baiting out card effects or dealing with something like, say, Thunder Dragon Colossus, which is stopping you from searching. You can just use Impermanence, shut its effect down for the turn, and still search. One niche application I actually like against this when I'm facing like a Pendulum deck is if you go first and you set this, you can not only negate one of their monster effects, like say Electromite for instance, but you can also negate a Pendulum Scale effect as long as you place it in either of the Pendulum zones so that it's facing something like a Servant of Endymion. So two more similar hand trap-esque monsters are Artifact Lancia and Dimension Shifter. So Artifact Lancia has been around for a while. It's a pretty known card. It basically prevents cards from being banished for the rest of the turn after you just pitch it from your hand. This is obviously very strong against a deck like Orcusts because they need to banish their Orcust monsters from the graveyard in order to use their effects. That's things like Orchestrated Nightmare, Harp Horror, Symbol Skeleton, the usual suspects. And it also can be very useful against a Thunder Dragon deck, for instance, because they're trying to banish their Thunder Dragon monsters to use their effects. You will want to use this so that that isn't an option for them. It can also be useful in a number of different rogue situations. I would say though that those are probably the best two, and Dimension Shifter is similar but different. So Dimension Shifter has a slightly stricter timing. You can only use it if there's no cards in your graveyard. So you really want to open with this card when you are, say, going second and then pitch it pretty much immediately. And it can still work really well against something like Orcusts, maybe not so well against something like Thunder Dragons, but in turn you get a lot more use against a deck like, let's say, Sky Strikers, or in particular something like Salamangrates, because they really need their monsters to hit the graveyard. If you use this, they won't be able to have things like Spinny and Jack Jaguar and even Salamangrate Roar, that none of that stuff will be able to go to the graveyard, so they basically have to just end their turn. So next are a couple of Floodgate cards. There Can Be Only One and Summon Limit. So There Can Be Only One is a fairly newish card and it's taken off in a pretty big way. It's basically the new Goes and Match and Rivalry of Warlords card. So your opponent can only control one monster of each type, and this is huge against a lot of different decks. Sky Strikers themselves like to use this card, and you'll see it a lot in decks like Subterra Guru Control, for instance, or maybe True Dracos, but it's useful especially against something like Orcus because they have a lot of machine monsters. With this on the field, this means that they can't have multiple machines, and that obviously isn't okay because they have things like Galatea and they have things like Dingirsu, and to not be able to have them all on the field is obviously very detrimental, especially if maybe it's a Cyber Dragon Orcus variant where there's also more machines in play. Very good against Salamangrates. All of their monsters are Cyberse monsters, so obviously this is not going to be okay for them. And Thunder Dragons cannot have multiple Thunder monsters in the field. So if you're playing like against a pure Thunder Dragon deck, that's not going to fly. And of course, any deck that's trying to use a Guard Dragon combo is not going to be able to. Now, another similar card is Summon Limit, which just makes it where neither player can summon more than 2 monsters in a turn. This is similarly good. I think that it has some advantages and some disadvantages. So the advantage, of course, is that it's useful in pretty much any matchup, although maybe not as much against Sky Strikers, but even then it can be okay. The one downside I think it has, though, is that if your opponent already has an established board, then Summon Limit is useless, whereas There Can Be Only One can at least be activated, though it might just get negated anyway. Now, something cool about Summon Limit to keep in mind, though, as well, is that like with There Can Be Only One, you can flip these cards on your opponent in the middle of their combo and put them in a pretty bad spot and disrupt them really harshly, especially if they've already used a lot of resources from their extra deck, then they'll be limited by, how many more summons they can conduct, which is usually just going to be none. So yeah, you can use either of these cards to great effect, but something to keep in mind is they're only really good when you're going first, and that's kind of just the rule with trap card side decking in general. Alright, next, Dark Ruler No More. So this is the last of the new Mega 10 promos. Dark Ruler No More is a spell that completely negates all your opponent's monster effects that are on the field at least, and they cannot chain monster effects to this. In exchange, of course, you can't deal damage to them this turn, but that's kind of a small price to pay if you're having to stare down, a Borreload Savage, a Thunder Dragon Colossus, a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend, or Dawn Dragster, Vortex Dragon, all the crazy things. You can just use Dark Ruler No More, and your opponent literally can't do anything about it, so now you're free to make your plays. This card is, of course, much better if you're going second against your opponent, since it wouldn't have any use if you're going first, and it's very hard to stop. However, do keep in mind that if your opponent has something like, say, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend on the field, even though they can't chain it directly to this card, if they have any other back row card maybe that they could chain, like even a Twin Twisters, then they could activate that and then chain Hot Red and target this and then still get negated. That doesn't come up too often, but it's something to keep in mind. This is very strong, but another small caveat to it is that you do need to be playing a deck that can put out enough monsters to actually swing over your opponent's board. Because things like Borreload Savage and all that stuff, Thunder Dragon Colossus, are still large monsters. If you're playing a slower paced deck, so something like maybe Guru Control or Altergeist or True Draco, and you can't necessarily swing over everything or pop everything somehow, then this card still may not actually be useful. I think it's something that's better for a combo deck that's just going second, because then you can negate all your opponent's stuff and still make several monsters that are large enough to swing over all of them. So some more spell and trap removal cards. Twin Twister, Cosmic Cyclone, and Heavy Storm Duster. All three of these cards are really useful. So Twin Twisters is a great way to deal with, honestly, a lot of rogue decks. Things like Guru Control, things like Altergeist and True Draco all have a really tough time with Twin Twisters. If you're going second and you start your turn with a very well-placed Twin Twisters, that can oftentimes be the game. And even if you're going first and you get to set Twin Twisters after you sighted it in, and you hit these cards in the end phase, you can hit something like Solemn Judgment even, and they'll be completely powerless to stop it. It can be useful against pendulums as well, but you have to keep in mind that it's only useful if you're going first and you set the card. Pendulum decks will complete their setup and their full combo when they get to go first, and at that point, Twin Twisters won't be worth anything. Cosmic Cyclone functions in a pretty similar way. It can be a good card to deal with pendulum decks, if you're going first, like I said. Can also get rid of cards without actually sending them to the graveyard. So if you banish something like an Orcus Crescendo, then it will be banished, which means it won't be able to use its graveyard effect. It can be a good way to bait it, for instance. And you can use this against a number of things. Salaman Great Roar works the same way. You'd rather that card be banished so it's not in the grave, so that Sunlight Wolf cannot just continue to get it back over and over and over again. Now, Heavy Storm Duster is another really strong one. It kind of has the benefits of Twin Twisters in that you can pop 2 cards, which is extremely deadly. But being a trap means that if you're going second, this card is basically going to be useless to you. The good thing though is if you're playing a deck that benefits from traps, like obviously Altergeist, but also maybe a Paleozoic deck, where you can just chain to these trap card activations, then yeah, having Heavy Storm Duster is a great card and probably a little bit better than Twin Twisters for you. So 2 more Floodgate cards, Imperial Order and AntiSpell Fragrance. So these are the cards that are going to be very, very much like lights out for Sky Strikers and Pendulums in particular. So Imperial Order is at 1, which means that you can't necessarily rely on seeing it. For that reason, I think it's sometimes better placed just in the main deck, but you can side it in, and it just negates spell effects. You'll take some damage during every standby phase, but usually just a couple of turns of not being able to activate spells is more than enough to beat a Sky Striker or a Pendulum player. Now, another card though, AntiSpell Fragrance, is a little bit more extreme. For Pendulum players, this basically means they cannot set scales entirely, like by game mechanics they just are not allowed to activate scales while AntiSpell Fragrance is up. And also it will slow down any normal spell cards, Dragon Shrine, Terraforming, Spell Power, Mastery, any of those things. And of course for Sky Strikers, that means they're gonna have to set their engage, set their multi-roll. So it just sets them back a turn. And Sky Strikers don't exactly have the luxury of putting anything strong on the field otherwise. So these 2 cards together can make those matchups very easy for you. Now, Red Reboot is a card that has seen some mixed success in the last couple of months, but it's still very good because this stops trap cards. In a world where even things like Solemn Judgment can be stopped by this is actually a pretty scary card. So Subterra Guru Control, again, Paleozoics, Altergeist, all of these decks that have lots of traps, you dealing with traps is a nightmare. If they get to go first and set all their trap cards, you're in for a world of hurt. They're going to disrupt all of your plays, but by using Red Reboot, you can not only negate their traps, but they can no longer use traps for the rest of the turn. The caveat, of course, with Red Reboot is if you can't actually kill them that turn, or at least find some kind of way to get rid of the rest of the traps that they get to set, because Red Reboot actually gives them an extra one, then you probably don't need to be using this card. So it's kind of something that reminds me of Dark Ruler No More in that way. You are shutting down their back row, but if you don't kill them, then by next turn they'll have amassed so many cards that they can use that they'll probably make a big comeback and you'll obviously regret it. Still though, Red Reboot is good. You can activate it from your hand, so when you're going second, it's still extremely useful for you. And this is still something that's just a blowout card against said decks. Still though, with Solemn Judgment at 3, this can stop Solemn Judgment, but you have to be careful because it can be hit by Solemn Judgment. And all those decks that run lots of traps are going to be running triple Solemn, of course. So don't rely too much on this card. A similar card, though it wouldn't seem like it on the surface, is Evenly Matched. So Evenly Matched against a lot of these trap-based decks can be similarly deadly. Things like Guru Control and Altergeist and Paleozoics and True Draco all need a lot of back row and like sometimes a field spell and stuff as their setup, and by using Evenly Matched, you can basically clear away all of it. When you go second, you can just enter your battle phase and use this card. If they have a Solemn Judgment, then this is going to, of course, bait their Solemn Judgment, but if they don't, then pretty much everything is going to go, and that's very brutal for them. They might have something else like Dark Bribe if it's also like a Mystic Mind deck, but even against Mystic Mind, this can actually be a pretty good, counter to that. And this can be useful if you're trying to bait negations from a more mainstream combo deck, but you have to be careful. It might bait, the activation of a Hot Red Dragon or a Dawn Dragster or Borreload Savage, but it won't actually get rid of the field. So for those, I'd still think that Nibiru or something else like, Super Polymerization, spoiler, gonna get into that, or something like Raw Sphere Mode would be better. This is also pretty good against Sky Strikers. They don't usually have a way to negate Evenly Matched if they don't run Solemn Judgment, and that can get rid of a lot of cards that they maybe got to set for free during the end phase with something like Multi-Roll. And since I alluded to it, Super Poly is the next card. So Super Polymerization is a card that I honestly cannot sing high enough praise for. I think it's incredibly strong. So this card's at 3 now. It's been coming off the ban list for the last year or so. It lets you just fusion summon with your opponent's cards. The catch being that you do have to discard a card, but since you can use your opponent's monsters, that's obviously good, and your opponent cannot respond to it with anything. This is great against 2 decks in particular, Orcust and Salamangreats, although it's useful against other things too. So against Orcust, you can make Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, and that just takes 2 dark monsters, so you can take a Dead Girsu and a Long Girsu, and then they can't even use Orcust Crescendo against it. Their Crescendo is now dead. You can also use it against Salamangreats to make Violet Chimera. It's very easy, and you can actually sometimes kill people in one turn with it. And even against other decks, there's things like Predaplant Dragostapelia, Mud Dragon of the Swamp, that can make this card useful even against rogue strategies. You can actually find uses for it against something like Guru Control or True Draco if your opponent isn't careful. So this is a card that I think is honestly incredible. It's a great way to dodge things. I think it's honestly right up there with something like the Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere Mode. So definitely make use of it if your deck can, of course, afford the extra deck space. And last but not least is Artifact, Sanctum, and Scythe. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of consider them one because it's a collective engine type of thing. So Artifact Sanctum is a card that it was played a lot last format, not played quite as much now, but it's still really very strong. So when you flip Sanctum, you can summon an artifact monster from your deck, and the card that you're going to be summoning is Artifact Scythe. You could summon Lancia if you wanted to, but that maybe like a last attempt situation thing. Scythe is good because it then stops your opponent from summoning extra deck monsters for the rest of the turn. This is good for the obvious reasons. Orcust decks, Salamangreat decks, Sky Striker decks, none of them will be able to use their extra deck, so this is a great thing to have. You'll want to use this early most of the time, but you can actually get extra use out of something like Scythe by waiting for your opponent to go through a few of their extra deck cards already. So say you're facing an Orcust deck and you went first and you set this card. If you activate Sanctum at the start of their turn, maybe they'll pass, and if you can kill them next turn, fine. But you could wait for them to summon, let's say, make their Nightmare Cerberus, and then maybe make their Nightmare Mermaid, and then you could activate it, and now you still can't summon monsters from the extra deck, but they just wasted the Nightmare part of their engine, so if they do survive until the next turn, that part will be gone, so it's a good way to deal with threats. Okay, and those are 20 Yu-Gi-Oh! Side deck cards that you can use against the meta right now. These are all very versatile, but even with 20 cards, I still missed a lot of obvious things. So point them out to me in the comments. Let me know what other side deck cards you're using right now and how there's so much stuff, and it's important to actually know your matchups and know how to make the most use of the side deck cards and all that. So hopefully this was helpful. Also, if you liked the playmat that I used to show all these different side deck cards, it came from Inked Gaming. If you want, you can get a custom playmat with any design that you want, in fact, and if you use the code APS10, you'll get a 10% discount. So pretty cool. Okay, I've gone on long enough. Thumbs if you like the video, subscribe for more content like this, and without further ado, I'll see you guys in the next one. Pass turn.